Oh, yes. Yes, we have now a right-wing government, but nothing is comparable to Bolsonaro. It's simply unique. Poor our great brother Brazil.
It's a great tragedy here. Well, but history keeps moving forward, right? And one day this will be all over. So
we are left with just 2 minutes now.
Okay.
2 minutes.
Okay.
So I start at
we are
11 sharp, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You can start at 7:30. I mean 2 p.m. GMT. Yeah.
GMT,
sorry
right?
for that.
No problem.
Okay.
So,
really, all the organization
you all the
has been
participants
so incredibly smooth.
Yes,
so,
it's great. Yes.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. I couldn't answer to Rasigan because my mail didn't allow me, I don't know why, to send mails, but have you read what he sent us? That a student has been shot. Oh, what
in Johannesburg.
Yep. In Johannesburg, yes. A student was shot. And then is why perhaps Rasigan is not going to come today.
Yeah, what a shame.
Yeah, what a shame.
Welcome, Bangchoke. Welcome, Alan Freeman. Welcome, KJ.
So hello everyone. This is João Marcos speaking. I'd like to introduce you the lecture number 10 of the Chris Freeman Centenary lecture series. We have the pleasure to listen today to Judith Sutz, Professor Judith Sutz, and the speaker Leonardo Souza. Judith Sutz is from Uruguay and Leonardo Souza from Mexico. And the title of the presentation by Leonardo Souza will be the critique on NSI, dilemmas and new challenges. This is a series in honor of Chris Freeman, the founding father of the modern innovation studies. It's due to his centenary year, so Rajesh took the lead and organized this very interesting series. He leads the alumni network of the Global X, and which is founded by Benedict Lundvall, and it's co-hosted by, on this seminar series is co-hosted by the Unimatrix. So about Leonardo Souza, he's an economist, researcher, and innovation policy consultant in Mexico. He's in charge of the Knowledge and Technology Transfer Office, NODUS. He promoting responsibly innovation management practice and sustainable transitions from a local development perspective. Since 2011, technical evaluator and policy advisor for local and federal policy programs. His main research interests are emerging technologies in developing countries, responsible innovation management, technoethics, and co-evolutionary process of institutional change and sustainable development. doing most of the research from an interdisciplinary perspective, combining evolutionary economics, institutional studies, and social and philosophy studies of science and technology. Professor Judith Sutz, she's a professor at the University of the Republic of Uruguay. In 2018, Chris Freeman, visiting fellow at the Science Policy Research Unit, University of Sussex. She has a master's degree in development planning from the Central University of Venezuela and PhD in socioeconomic development from Sorbonne University, and she's a researcher in the field of science, technology, society, and development, and a very known researcher here in Latin America on systems of innovation perspective, and it's a pleasure to be part of this table with her. So the next session will be in Lecture 11. Will be the Lecture 11 Wednesday, 17 March, of quantitative and qualitative research approach in national science, national systems of innovation by Dr. Biodun Ektogun of the National Center of Technology Management, Nigeria, and Resi Oyekunle. I'm sorry if I'm misspeaking the names. It's a very diverse combination. All different peoples of different countries, and it's not very easy to follow all the specific spelling. So the chair will be Professor Yogo of University of General Sarmiento, Argentina, and the moderator will be Dr. Oluyemi. So the 17th Global X Conference will be held between 3rd and the 5th from November in 2021 in Heredia, Costa Rica, with the title Innovation Systems and Sustainable Development, New Strategies for Growth, Social Welfare, and Environmental Sustainability. So here you can see the dates, the open and submission dates, the deadline, so it's still open, you can still send. The acceptance notification will do by June. And I invite you all to visit the website and to participate in this conference. The Zoom platform, it's provided by United Nations University, Maastricht Economic and Social Research Institute of Innovation Technology. We are also streaming through YouTube, and we thanks Unimerit for providing the access to Zoom platform. And it's also recorded for academic purpose. It's important for everyone to know that once they are here, they are agreeing to record the meeting and to be recorded. So it's standard procedure that we all should. Finally, we are still welcoming questions that we want to share with the participants of the last two panel discussion that will be in the 1st April or 7th April. And we'll be receiving questions that you want, if you want to ask them, you should email the quiz .innovationstudies@gmail.com, and so we'll be welcoming that. Now I will pass the floor to Judith Sutz. She will present for an introduction, some introduction remarks on the theme, and then Leonardo Souza will be delivering his speech after Judith Sutz. So thank you all to be here.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you. Thank you, Rakesh, for this magnificent organization. I am very, very happy to be here with all, particularly all the young colleagues that are working in, let me see, oh, I cannot share once, Joao, let me enter my, okay. I will try to do it right. It's no, oh yes, here I can do it. Please, okay. Can you please confirm that you can see my screen?
It is just coming up, Professor. No problem.
Okay.
Please take your time. No, not
okay.
yet. It is coming up. Yeah.
Okay, you tell me. So I am not going to speak in
now it's okay, but please go full screen.
Okay.
In the presentation mode, please.
Yes, I put it. Oh my goodness, I don't know what happened, but let's see. Okay. Can you see it?
Yeah, I think it is coming up. You have clicked the right button, it will come up.
Okay.
Yeah. It will come up.
I hope so. Because it should.
I think, Professor, maybe the first presentation button on the command line, if you.
Yes, I put it. I put it.
That one.
As always, but.
Or maybe there is another button on the lower bar. Yeah, on the right hand side, there is one presentation button. On the lowest bar.
Yes,
yeah, please come down. Please come down. I can see the cursor. Okay. Yeah, please come down.
Yes. Where? Here.
Can you see the 40% mark on the bottom line?
Yes.
And on the left side, there is one button. That is presentation button. In the shape of a cup. In the shape of a cup, there is an icon. That one.
Okay.
I mean.
What? Okay. Share. Okay. Let's see if now I can do it.
Can you see the 40% mark? Near it, there is a plus minus sign, and near the minus sign, there is a cup-like thing on the bottom line.
Okay. Now I can. Okay. It's okay now. Can you see it?
Good. Please go ahead. Good.
Okay. So, if you have my screen now, you can see to the left a photo of Chris Freeman. This photo was taken from a presentation that Freeman did on Bernal and the social function of science. You know, in the Economic of Hope, the first chapter is on exactly Bernal and the social function of science. You can download this video from internet, and I would encourage you really to see it, because you will have the flavor of Chris Freeman talking, and this is really rewarding. So now we are entering in the 10th Freeman Centenary lecture about critique on national system of innovation, dilemmas, and new challenges. So, in order to be brief, to think critically, to spot dilemmas, to identify challenges following Freeman steps, first of all, we need to know that for Freeman, interdisciplinarity matters a lot. I will recommend you to read Malthus with a Computer. This is a wonderful, wonderful piece of work where Freeman said, neither economist nor sociologist nor political scientist have satisfactory theories of social change, and it is unlikely that they will develop them unless they overcome their fragmentation into separate, jealously guarded kingdoms and learn to cooperate with each other and with natural scientists. Moreover, Freeman wrote a comment on Alvin Toffler, The Shock of the Future book, in the journal Futures. And there he said, the fragmented approach of the social sciences is now increasingly a barrier to the understanding of what is happening to human social systems. There is a desperate need for the approach taken by John Stuart Mills or Karl Marx, the linking together of sociology, economics, politics, and philosophy. So most of you are economists, but if you really want to follow Freeman Steps, remember, interdisciplinary matters. Values come first. Read Science and Economy at the National Level. This is the second chapter in the Economic of Hope. And if you allow me, I will read it to you a very small part of it. No economist, whether he is left-handed, right-handed, or ambidextrous, can possibly determine the ends of society in pursuing research and development. The really big choices in science policy, or in that part of science policy which goes under the heading of research and development policy, are political questions or political moral questions. And there is no economic magic formula to resolve these issues. So look at the values. Delve into the qualitative side of things, take care with the quantitative side of things, and read research comparisons. This is a piece that Freeman wrote more than 50 years ago in Science, the journal Science. And it is really worth reading a Briton reflecting on the one side on the United States and on the other side of the Soviet Union, and how a small island, Britain, look at the world. It is very rewarding. It reminds us Liszt reflecting from Germany in the 19th century, and it's very, very useful for us people from the South. So applying these to national system of innovation in our countries. The first thing is look with thousand theoretical lenses to your own reality, because as very well Freeman say, you need to look to indicators with your own head. If not, you are misleading totally. For instance, let's take the issue of learning. For people in the highly industrialized countries, learning is something very natural. You go, you learn to go to university, you get a degree, and you can easily apply what you have learned into reality. We can also in our countries go to the university, but for us it's much more difficult to apply what we have learned for our reality. So opportunities to learn make all the difference between these two types of countries, but you cannot look at that if you don't look with your own head. Remember, Abraham Maslow, the great American psychologist, used to say, for a person that only have a hammer, the world looks like a nail. Avoid that. The problem is not that you differ from others. The challenge is to find your own strengths and use them as a lever. For instance, the capacity to innovate in scarcity condition that was so incredibly important in southern countries now facing COVID-19, when all type of devices were wrapped from the market by the very rich countries, and at least we in Uruguay, we face ourselves without respirators, without any kind of thing, and we were able to do it by ourselves, well, because we have a good science-based. So Freeman did not suffer from the white man's burden. You know what that is? The man white burden is a poem by Rudyard Kipling that prizes British Empire and the civilizatory role of the natives. Freeman was not that. He fully acknowledged that innovation has not lifted all people's boats. He said, the basis for a sustained, although cyclical movement away from these lower limits of human misery and degradation was provided outside the third world countries by successive technological revolutions. I am pretty sure that he would agree with the following reflection of a master of development thinking, Albert Hirschman. I would encourage you, read Albert Hirschman. Read the Strategy of Economic Development 1968. Read Freeman, of course, read Hirschman, and look at that. One of the outstanding feats of modern economics is the way in which the analysis of the growth process of advanced industrial countries has yielded an apparatus of seemingly ready applicability to the most primitive economies. But the more useful theories are in one setting, the less are they likely to be so in a completely different one. An attempt to apply them may turn out to be a lengthy detour rather than a shortcut. Again, think with your own head. This is why you need to critique what you receive, not to throw it away, but to really be sure that you understand it and you can use it creatively. Freeman put challenges forward very clearly. I am going to put two of them. The bias in the world research innovation system is so great as to constitute a danger to the future of human society. Very little of the world's R&D is in fact directly concerned with the elementary needs of the majority of the world's inhabitants. Freeman wrote this 25 years ago. You know that the World Health Organization coined the term the 90-10 gap. In health, 90% of all the research in the world is devoted to illnesses of the 10% of the population, and the other way around, only 10% of the resources of research in health are devoted to the illnesses of the 90% of the population. These are really the deep, deep challenge we have to face. So who is going to pick the gauntlet of thinking of innovation, taking into account inequality and sustainability and rising authoritarianism? Because innovation and innovation systems are directly related to these three urgent challenges. The task ahead is hard. The prospect of rapid success are slim. But Freeman's own words are a threat to follow. Never give way to cynicism or despair. Remain true to the ideals of youth. So with that, I pass the floor to our speaker, Leonardo. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Sutz. As always, an inspiring talk. I have the pleasure to hear you. I think that you don't know this story, but I was doing some work of staff when the Global X Congress was taking place in Mexico in 2008. So I have the pleasure then to hear you speak. And of course, in South Africa, in Pretoria in 2016, about the Global X Academy. So it's always rewarding to hear your words and such inspiring invitation for all of us. So thank you very much. Well, I want to share my presentation. Give me just a second, please. Okay. Well, first of all, I want to express my gratitude to all the colleagues who give their work to make this happen. Thank you, all of you, especially to Rajesh. He has been an incredible entrepreneur making the networks that this make happen, this event. Congratulate yourself, my friend. This is such a great event, and I'm really happy to be here. Well, I must confess that when Rajesh approached to us asking us a list of topics that we would like to include into the lecture, I was reading at the time the Advanced Introductory of National Systems of Innovation, a recent book by Chaminade and Lundvall. And there is a small chapter there that talks about the new challenges that this epistemic framework will assess. So that's part of the inspiration of this lecture. Of course, this lecture not be just about that book. I did an historical approach to understand how the framework of national systems of innovation has been evolving in time. So as we know from other type of studies, not from economics, but from social studies of science and technology, we know that the disciplines and the frameworks doesn't evolve in an optimal way. And by that, I mean that not always the last book or the last research, of course, has the most advanced construction of the theory. Sometimes we pick some issues and some issues are left behind. So there's always a possibility to pick some depths or epistemic depths and bring it to the present and try to build some forward of the theory from that point. So I also considered some other parts of the literature. We must recognize that the literature of systems of national innovation, there's a broad-based from some decades now. So we have theoretical advances, of course, but much of it is empirical studies. So we have studies from Latin America, from Asia, from Eastern and Western part of Europe, from the US, of course, from China. So there is a vast literature that we need to recognize also and try to understand how this literature can help to put forward and to progress the national systems of innovation holistic framework. The objectives of this lecture are based mainly thinking about the students and the young researchers to provide them a general review of the epistemic scope and conceptual boundaries of the National System of Innovation Holistic Framework. Of course, stressing some relevant dilemmas and new challenges in the continuous refinement of this. And I must stress this is a young theory. I think that if we provide the students the boundaries and perhaps the scope, there is the most interesting questions to do research, where the frameworks just are in their own boundaries and limits. So this is an exciting point where we can do research. I mentioned before that this kind of framework belongs to a young theory, and that's true if we compare them to the mainstream of economics. And I'm talking here about neoclassical economics, with more than 100 years of collective theoretical enrichment since the marginalist economics arrival. So we have also the challenge to put forward our own theories, and that's part of this aspiring to make this lecture happen. What kind of analytical approach we are having here? Well, as I mentioned before, it's an historical review. We are trying to looking backward to understand the evolutionary process of national systems of innovation framework under epistemic practices in order to identify forward challenges. We have learned from other epistemics disciplines, such as social studies of science and innovation, that communities of practice, they pick up some part of the theory, some part of the methods. And we need to identify if we can do some progress from their categories and then to compare them to the methodologies and then to compare them to the policy outcomes. We must understand that economics always want to give some economic recommendations to change reality. So economics is an applied knowledge. So in order to that to take place, we need to understand and compare if all the theory that is really rich is always expressed in epistemical studies. And I think that not always has been, and that's part of the reflections from this lecture. And there are some points that we must remember. Most of them are already been said by the iconic figures such as Christopher Freeman, as just Professor Sutz mentioned before. So there is a lot that could be taken from the past, from our basis, but we need to understand which are the limits of our framework. So I will gladly try to do that work. Of course, this is not the most advanced work. I just pick up some issues that I think these are really relevant. Well, it assumes, of course, a dialectical evolution of the discipline. And by that, I mean, we don't need to think about the dialectical part of Hegel that he considered the constant and universal higher outcome always from knowledge production. But we understand that our discipline and our framework perhaps is much more close to a selective process with non-optimal progress and subject of new evaluations and recalculations. So we can always learn from the past. And of course, as you might see, this perhaps is a method influenced by philosophy of science studies. The outline of the lecture first states how the natural innovation system has been into their evolutionary process. I think that we can understand that into a three-stage process. I will mention that in the next slide. And I pick up some kind of challenges and new dilemmas from this epistemic framework. The first one is the treatment that we have to such important topics such as institutions. Institutions are explanatory in our framework. We must recognize that most of the epistemic work sometimes concludes that we don't have the proper institutions. So it's not, so we are explaining the performance of innovation and growth based on the institutional setup. If we don't have the right one, we don't have an efficient performance, right? So the institutional setup is a really important part of the conceptual categories in our framework. So we need to understand more what we mean by institutions and how they evolve and how they can be changed. Or perhaps we are dealing with strong parts of lock-in and path dependence, not just from the technological side of it, but perhaps from the institutional part also. And this also has to do with institutional change. What we know from our theory about institutional change. There is an extraordinary paper from Nelson, I think it's 1994, and another one from 1995 about the co-evolutionary part of institutions with industries. But we need to go further than that and try to understand how to change institutions. Some other institutional studies have mentioned about the entrepreneurship agent who by policy and by some other instruments can change the system. This is not a one-person job, but a collective movement that could take place in order to change the collective reality into a system, into, as Professor Sutz mentioned, a human social system, and that's really important. So there are some advances in other disciplines that perhaps we can reflect on them and we can take in our own framework. And of course, there is the topic about governance. The iconic paper from Freeman about Japan suggests that perhaps the good performance and the catching up processes that Japan took in the 20th century could be explained about a coherence of different systems and the coherence of different subsystems that not always are moved by market incentives or are not market one behavior systems. And by that, I mean that we have subsystems such as the science and technology subsystem. Much of the scientists are not moved by economic incentives, but more from peers recognition. They are trying to win the Nobel Prize. They want to give a leap into the knowledge and be recognized by that. We have also the government subsystem, and they have their own kind of values, as Professor Sutz mentioned. They have their own kind of incentives also. So how can we get the coherence of a diverse system with diverse subsystems on it? The economic theory is it's well known to deal with markets and economic values, but what about other kind of values? We have attention there in our theory, and perhaps including institutional theory, understanding different kind of values, different axiological accounts, we can try to have some coherence into a system. So that's part of one of the challenges I want to mention. And of course, we have seen different teleologies. Teleologies is just a word to mention what kind of purposes are behind social human systems. So we have subsystems moved by markets. They have their own teleologies. In national system of innovation, the main teleology is growth, of course, and innovation. And perhaps innovation is not an end, but a means to more important teleologies, such as well-being and sustainable growth and inclusive growth. So in our literature, there have been some incredible statements that stress we need some different teleologies. One part of this literature came from Arocena and Sutz, of course, but many other colleagues also, which they stress that, well, we need not just to think about growth. Perhaps we can make an error there, because we can have enormous growth, we can have employment, but we can also have a toxic exposure of our society to emerging technologies, perhaps such as nanotechnology or not green chemistry, right? So growth will need to be some sort with other characteristics, such as sustainable, such as inclusive. So we need different teleologies, and that will change also the rules inside the system and the functions inside the system. So this is not a non-meaningful issue. And of course, we will consider also the dark side of innovation. And by the dark side of innovation, we means that we need to consider the complete ontology of technology effects. Economists, we used to concentrate just in the good ones, right? Such as growth, such as employment. But what about the other ontologies, the dark part and the dark side? We know that there is a lot of risk of some technologies, and sometimes we select technologies that we can't control. We have such examples in nuclear sector, of course. We have more examples in chemistry that produce cancer to the agriculture people who work in that sector. We have pollution, of course. So we have so many other parts of the technology that should be considered and have a complete ontology, not just the right one, but also the other one, to be protective and to be precautionary of this kind of effects. And of course, we will finish with some epistemic suggestions. What I mentioned about how can we understand the evolution of our national system of innovation framework? I suggest that we can understand that in 3 stages. The first stage is when it arises the fundamental categories and the disciplinary position of the framework. We can go back into 4 iconic books, of course, Dossi et al. In 1988. This iconic book named Technical Change and Economic Theory. I have heard that in some networks of our colleagues, this is called the Bible because you can find just the basics there and you can answer a lot of questions from our framework also. And I agree with that. There's also the book by Lundvall in 1992. I think that this is the first statement of where this framework should go. And it has really solid chapters. Then there is more a comparative study made by Nelson, which this is more the practical part of our framework. This is not a theoretical book, but this is one of the first works that try to compare and try to do a practical work with our framework. There is also a Nordic study, which I didn't put here, but that there is also a book about that in that years from the late 80s to the 90s. And of course, Edquist's book by named Systems of Innovation, which this is the second part of trying to make a solid contribution of where this framework should go into the future and how to do research about that. So I think that this first phase, phase number 1, this is the most iconic one. And then we should try to expect that after this, there is a lot of bibliography that have many other studies. So we have the stage 2, which is categorized by diversity. Here we are introducing the different levels of analysis that came from the local, urban, regional, sectoral, national, global, multinational, perhaps. So we have a variety of our own framework proposed by different colleagues, and of course, different teleologies also. In this stage, it addresses also that growth should be also congruent with environmental values, that we should also consider inclusive growth. So we have in this period from the 2000 years to the 2020s, we have different proposals with variety, but also different teleologies. Of course, this stage 2 is a long one, so this continue. And we have so many different perspectives also, and studies from different continents. And the stage 3, it can be considered when there is a solid work trying to make clear with all this variety how we should go into the future. And I consider one part of this stage 3. Of course, this stage 3 doesn't finish this. The history will come in the future. But this stage 3 is trying to have some epistemic synthesis and try to establish where are the next challenges. And perhaps our young students, our young scholars could provide more guidance into this next stage. We must recognize that in all this diversity, there is an epistemic position that is shared by our community. We must understand that this is an holistic framework. Much of the colleagues have discussed if we should consider this a theory, the national systems of innovation, or should we consider this an epistemical framework trying to do research into reality. And I guess the position is to have an holistic framework that is open to different and contextual innovation determinants. Part of the theoretical part is that we don't understand just one determinant on a prescription determinant. We are researchers have the responsibility to use the framework and try to understand which are the determinants, what kind of order is inside the system, what kind of um, um, what kind of activities and functions are inside the system, and perhaps all the systems are different because they are influenced by the context, and we have different context in the world and in history. So we don't consider this theory an optimal prescription. It's not it's the opposite. It's a non-optimal prescription. Of course, one of the one part of the theory is to consider that there is heterogeneity of systems of innovation and various levels of analysis, as I mentioned before. And of course, there is, if we read Dossi 1988 book, there is many introductory parts of the chapters made by Freeman. And you can read that there is an epistemic position, and it's really inspiring to read that. I really recommend to do so. There is a non-orthodox economic standing point. It's a clear step aside from the neoclassical theoretical assumptions and the mainstream economics. There is no optimal rational agent. And that's really important from an institutional perspective, because if we don't have an optimal rational agent, well, how those agents take decisions? And they take decisions by paradigms, and they take decisions by shared mental models, such as institutions, if we consider them as rules. So we are dealing with agents with boundary rationality. We have restrictions of information and calculation affecting the neoclassical theoretical assumption of rational maximization. So our theory also embrace change and understand that these human social systems respond to an evolutionary process. We have technical change, but also change by institutions. So we have an interdependent system, and it's not always clear when we look at the practical studies if we are taking this seriously. Sometimes there is a list of organizations, a list of formal rules, but not always a lecture about the coevolutionary process. And I think that we are not doing so because we don't have the right methodologies, perhaps, to do so. We have the conceptual things. Perhaps we need a more detailed theory, but we don't have the methodological clear issues to do that kind of work. When we consider what Christopher Freeman says, that we must understand this kind of research using historical research, using historical context also. So we need different kind of tools, and perhaps we can take that from other parts of discipline in social sciences. And of course, there is the unity or systemic coherence. This is just an hypothesis. As we mentioned before, national systems of innovation are not an optimal theory, but we are trying to search into reality if there is a systemic coherence. And well, how can we understand that coherence? The relationship between economic structure and institutional complementary. And when I say institutional complementary, we are not just talking about organizations. We are talking about also rules of the game and parts of the culture and values. And of course, there is a close connection between the collective innovation performance, their efficiency and efficacy, which is conditioned to how the institutional complementary takes part into the economic structure. Of course, we are dealing with a macro and meso level of analysis. This is not a micro level. We don't have a micro theory of natural systems of innovation. We use other theoretical frameworks for that. And it's important to understand that we are dealing with an endogenous process explanation based on interactive learnings, capabilities accumulation, and knowledge autonomy. If we are trying to have an endogenous process explanation, we also need an institutional change explanation from an endogenous process. If we don't have an explanation how from the inside of the system can emerge the institutional change, then the institutional change doesn't make part from our theory. It's an external part of it. So we must understand that these are part of our epistemic positions from the beginning of the first iconic books. And of course, we must understand that there is historical dependence. We are dealing with systems which are non-ergodic systems. They express path dependency and locking processes, not just in technology and economics, but also in the institutional framework. And that meets formal and informal rules. Of course, this is not a determinant inquiry approach. This is where there are some insights of how to deal with our frameworks. There is recognition in the community that we must approach these processes by reflexive history methods and using historicized facts. These are epistemic methods. And of course, this doesn't make a step aside from quantitative methods. There's also the possibility to use quantitative and qualitative, but we need to understand what kind of approach we are dealing as the basic approach here. And I think that the iconic books mentioned that this should be a reflexive and contextual history, trying to understand the holistic approach of the system and how it is how has its own order inside of it. That's the most important part, I think. Well, mentioning the dilemmas and the new challenges. Well, what kind of institutional treatment are we having? If we see the natural system of innovation as an evolutionary process of their own discipline, well, what kind of institutional treatment do we have? I must say that there is tremendous and gorgeous chapters in two iconic books. The first one is the Lomble book of 1992. I think it's chapter 2. This is a really good contribution by John Johnson and Lomble himself, where they states, what do we need to understand about institutions? And the second one is Edquist 1992, which is also a collaboration with Bjorn Johnson, where he states also what kind of understanding of institutions we could have. He deals also with some stress positions if we consider institutions such as organizations, or we should take the part of the institutional studies that understand it more than rules. So we consider institutions from these iconic chapters. I really recommend to read them. But I think that even though we have that great chapters, I think when we go to empirical studies, we don't always have the analysis from this part of the theory. So that iconic books mentioned, we should consider institutions as organizations, public and private ones. They are the players of the game, and this is mentioned by the Nobel Prize winner Douglas North, where he mentioned that institutions should be considered as the rules of the game. So institutions is also considered as rules of the game. These are rules shaping behavior, not just the formal ones, such as policy, perhaps, but also the informal ones, the ones that have to deal with values, with culture, with that kind of notion that we have read in Christopher Freeman's work, actually. And perhaps we are dealing with a normative matrix that is intertwined, and that means that the formal institutions are not a step aside from the informal institutions. They form a matrix one. And some studies also mention that the formal ones are sometimes made by the informal one. They are just a way to establish more formally the social norms of a society, and they represent the values of a society. So if we move one kind of that rule, perhaps it can move the rest of the system, or perhaps won't move any part of the system, because there could be path dependency and strong resistance of change into a matrix of normative institutions. So this must recognize that our rules shared by the society. These are collective mental models in a bound rationality condition. These are guiding posts promoting social wanted behavior, but also unwanted behavior. Sometimes rules are just considered as regulations, where firms will not do some kind of activities, but we must consider that also institutions could guide behavior. And I mean by that not only on market systems, but perhaps on non-market systems, they have their own rationality and their own logics and their own incentives, and they have the rules to guide their own behavior. And this normative matrix, it's really important because explain how can be done the interactive collaboration between agents from different logics. I know, and we know that innovation is a collective process. And if we are talking about market institutions, about market organizations and not market ones, we need to understand how could be a convergent behavior in high uncertainty environments could take place. And one of the critique of the work made in the ground is that there are some secondary or absent analysis, such as understanding institutions as social norms, informal institutions shaping behavior. There is not so many works about how, if there are soft institutional failures, not just the formal ones, but the soft ones. And of course, understanding that institutions could be also cognitive and behavior path dependence hypotheses in organization and in subsystems. Some of the conclusions of the work is that, well, some industries, some firms doesn't want to develop their own technology. They want to buy technology from outside. But perhaps this is not just a matter of prices, or perhaps this is not a matter of having the supporting organizations that could deal with this interaction, but perhaps it's about values. It's perhaps about what's the logic inside the mind of the enterprise owner and how they took decisions. They have their own values, and we know values change not just by regions, but change also in time. So this could explain also why in some countries who have stressed some important efforts to have a complementary institutional setup, a supportive one, they have the supportive infrastructure. They have some policies there, try to foster collaboration between knowledge organizations and the firms, but they don't have the performance of innovation. And that's really strange. And it's perhaps because there are some logics behind what's the value, what's the axiological part of how these firms owners think. Or the system also could be part of a resistance from institutional matrix, which doesn't allow to have interactive performance between firms and learning and knowledge organizations. So we should consider this just as an hypothesis about many other determinants such as prices and more economical approaches also. Another challenge is how we deal with institutional change. We know that institutional setup is an important part of the theory. It's an explanatory part of how collective innovation performance could take place. But when it is detected as a barrier, there is no theory about institutional change or institutional entrepreneurship and how to get the right institutional arrangements. This theoretical absence has, of course, policy implications. If some of the studies conclude that, well, we don't have the right institutions and we just recommend policies made by government, well, perhaps government is not the best way to change culture and to change values. They can do their effort. There are some really good examples that it can be possible, perhaps. But if we don't look at a broader institutional matrix, and perhaps understanding that these changes could also take place from the ground, and by that I mean not the top-down approach of policy, but from the ground, perhaps from the firms, perhaps from societies, perhaps from researchers also, or any other part of the subsystems inside the national system of innovation. We are not dealing with a complete picture. We are just stressing in the traditional parts of understanding formal rules, and we are leaving behind some other processes. So there's a lot in my perspective. We should consider to have more detail in theory about these processes, how these processes could take place, who detonates these processes, how this could be a collective emergent processes. And some parts of institutional theory stress the importance of the agent or collective agent of institutional entrepreneurship. And perhaps that could be one of the proposals to answer this question. Well, there is also an important issue that I want to mention here, is about the governance of the system unity and coherence. And by that, I mean that we always think that the government's part is made, we give the monopoly of the governance of the system to government. And if we are talking about a wider system with subsystems with different logics, market logics and non-market logics, well, who has the control of that system? What kind of governance should we expect? We must understand that there is no central actor who coordinates all the interactions, but perhaps this is an emergent phenomenon. And perhaps if we get close to complex systems theory, we can understand more about this human social systems and how this could be possible be made, the coherence of the system. We know by the Japan study of Christopher Freeman that Japan shows a coherent system between their organizations of universities, but also firms, but also industrial policy agents and officers. So there is a coherence of the system. And it's really important to think how developing countries could have this kind of coherence into the system. Well, this is, I just mentioned this. Perhaps we should consider a meta-governance of the system. If we think about governance, if we think that the government is part of the legitimate part of doing changes into the system, but who changes the behavior of government? Perhaps the lock-in or the path dependence institution and culture and values are into the government sometimes, and how we can change that part of the governance part. That's an important question. Perhaps we should be taking the consideration of a meta-governance or a meta-institutional framework that can deal with the whole system governance. Of course, there are some proposals about different teleologies inside the systems. And by teleology, I already mentioned that we should consider the purpose or goals of human systems. There are diversified teleologies, not just based on growth, but different kinds of growth, inclusive growth and development, sustainable development also. So it suggests that innovation perhaps should not be treated just as ends, but means for higher purposes, such as human welfare, diminished poverty, or quality of life. This is important because this can make us think what should be the outcome of the system. How do we evaluate the system? Just by growth, or perhaps we should look into human welfare, perhaps, or sustainable development or inclusive development. So that changed the logic inside the system, that changed also the processes inside the system, and what kind of rules we should foster inside the system. Also, in these teleologies, there is an important subject, and this is that in developing countries, we must recognize that we have institutional weaknesses. And perhaps we don't have all the parts of the system or the constituents of the system. And we should consider new functions, such as the construction of the system itself. If there are missing organizations or missing institutions, there should be also a function to try to build this kind of institutional setup. And there is also important to consider the dark side of innovation, as I mentioned in the introduction. Innovation studies usually consider just the desirable outcomes of technological change, leaving behind the wall ontology effects. Remaining with this situation could foster a misleading comprehension of innovation phenomenon, but mainly a diminishing effect of the social welfare of innovation. As an example, we could have economic growth with air pollution and toxic exposure of our societies. And by that, I mean that also we have some policies that stress the importance to have new science and new technology. This doesn't take place inside the firms. This takes place in these big agendas. One of the big agendas in the recent times is the nanotechnology agenda from the US in 2000, where there is a strong effort to try to get into the market, to do this kind of science and technology push. So this is the state try to foster growth. But what happens if that growth in emerging technologies, which we don't know all the effects of the technology, should also consider toxic exposure? So we have a dilemma from the state, because the state is there try to regulate and try to protect society. But from one side, from their science and policy instruments. They are trying to foster new technologies, but they are also stressing toxic exposure or pollution, perhaps, at the nano level, right? So there is a dilemma here, there is a tension there, and we should consider that also. If we are just thinking about growth, or perhaps we should have more detailed kinds of growth with a precautionary effect of technology. Of course, we should consider that innovation has disruption, and disruption is not just in markets. There's a lot of studies that mention that disruption and obsolescence effect takes part in the whole of the status quo. So we have technological obsolescence also that should be considered, know-how obsolescence, tools and equipment obsolescence, and routines obsolescence, of course. There is also obsolescence in economic systems, but also in ecological systems where there is this disruption, where there is pollution, intensive extraction of natural resources, which are taken for the industry. There is climate change as a disruption of the ecology, and of course, global warming. But there is also a most interesting disruption. This is institutional disruption. Regulation for new technologies need new institutional setup, new rules, and they need to understand more about that technology. But we don't understand all the effects of technology until the technology is inside the markets and until it's exposed to environment and exposed to society. So how can we deal with that? We are dealing with a risk-taking decision here. We are considering growth as a good value, but we should also consider that this also has risks. So perhaps we need to put into balance these all two effects, not just considering the desirable outcomes of technological change, but also consider the non-desirable outcomes and do a summatory about that effect, mainly from the technologies who is fostered from the state. Well, need to recognize that social and technology studies have been addressing this kind of externalities and could be a viable source of epistemic categories and research methods to include into our frameworks. Some epistemic suggestions, perhaps we can go back into the basics. As I heard and as I read from many colleagues, Christopher Freeman was, of course, an economist, but he was considered also a social scientist in a whole. And such great economists, they are considered also not just economists, but with a wider perspective of society. We're talking, of course, about Marx, but also Veblen, also Schumpeter, and Freeman also shared an open vision of economics. So perhaps we can take some Freeman insights on his epistemic position. And I took this from the Dossier et al. Book, 1988, from some of the chapters. And Freeman wrote at that time, a satisfactory theory should certainly be one which conforms more closely to the available empirical evidence. It should also, like the other social sciences, take more account of the emergence of qualitative new features of the system behavior and of the capacity of human agents to falsify predictions based on past experiences. Greater humility is important, and as well as greater realism. There is also a part I want to share with you. This is also Freeman. He wrote this at the time, said, a satisfactory theory should certainly be one of which conforms more closely. Sorry, this is a copy of the other one. Sorry. It's important then, based on these descriptions, to build theory from grounded empirical facts and contrast it back to theoretical assumptions. This needs also more epistemical methods perhaps how to build theory from the ground. We as economists, sometimes we have presumptions, we have already categories that we are trying to put into reality. We don't have these methods taken from social sciences where they understand reality, and then when they try to get a category for that. So perhaps we need to build upon these ideas. And of course, consider interdisciplinary approaches. Perhaps to have a complementary between national systems of innovation and science and technology studies. And perhaps look into complexity theory for dynamic adjustment explanations of social systems. There is a wonderful book I really recommend to read for young scholars and students. This book is The Economy of Hope by Christopher Freeman. And he is already considering new teleologies of economic growth. He wrote about values, human values, which are important. We should consider the collective intentionality, not just individual rationalism, but also consider that there should be mental shared frames that guide the behavior and the decision taking into the system. And of course, considering as an output of technology and growth, the quality of life that could be a guidance about the output of the system, not just growth. So as some conclusions, considering institutional change into the research agenda is fundamental to maintain an endogenous theoretical explanation. If our theories are endogenous, we should consider institutional change as part of how to change the system inside the system. Perhaps including institutional entrepreneurship and agency theory. There is a lot of work done there that we could consider. Also, search for collective order and governance change in some of the institutional studies. Institutional studies, one of the weaknesses is that there is a lot of literature there, and there's not just one approach. There is many of them. There is old institutional traditions with Veblen, with Nord. There is a macro-sociological institutionalism. There is a historical part. There is a discourse institutionalism by Schmidt. And this is really interesting. This last one can help us to understand not just policy, but politics. How the process of politics took place inside a system. Who promotes the change? Where are the barriers of change? Which are the conceptions? And of course, who has the right to foster change? It is all society, or perhaps there is a small group that promote change, and which kind of values we need to understand and try to respond to that in order to understand the behavior that will take the system. So there is a lot of insights here. I want that perhaps the students and the young scholars should consider this into their research. I guess the most important parts of research and the most important questions are into the frontiers of our frameworks. So thank you very much for listening, and I will be more than glad to be in the discussion and to answer some questions. So thank you very much, all of you.
Our boss is Raje, so I asked him if I...
As always.
As always. So should I proceed, Raje?
Yes, Professor. Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So I would like to really thank Leonardo for a great lecture that opened the box of national system of innovation to humanism, as Chris Freeman would like, and particularly for introducing in his last verse the idea that we are not dealing only with policies, we are dealing with politics. and the question, who have the right to promote change? And I would add, who have the power to promote change? As Benteke Lundvall recognizes in this postscriptum of the second edition of the great book of 1992, in 2010, power was an issue that the theorization of national system of innovation didn't take too much into account, and for that they gave a perhaps too rosy picture of the whole issue. So I really am glad that Leonardo put these things into the table. I would like to make some few comments about institutional change. I ask myself, and this can be related to some of the questions that have been put in the chat on Africa. What is the right direction? The top down from institutions to policies, or the bottom up from policy to institutions? I am fed up in my own country to see, first of all, let's discuss the institutionality, and then comes the policy, but it should be the other way around, because institution depends on policies. You need institutions to foster policies. So start with policies, and then start with problems, and then start with people. The other thing is that I think that is absolutely right what Leonardo put forward. That is, if you have a sustainable and an inclusive system of innovation, the rules of the game are going to be different. It may be perhaps naive, perhaps obvious, but let me tell you that in policy terms, there is neither. Both are sustainability and inclusiveness as the directionality for system of innovation change deeply the rule of the game. And then comes something that is important. You talk about epistemic positions. I would also talk about theoretical position. Let me just share with you one thing that for me was really enlightening. It is told that Einstein used to discuss with Heisenberg about the nature of reality. And then Einstein said to Heisenberg, it is theory which determines what we can measure, what we can see. And so, yes, it is with kind of theory, with kind of theoretical approaches, are we looking into reality? Well, this is very, very important. And so the epistemic position, as well as the theoretical position, needs to be taken very seriously into account, as Leonardo said. Then comes the issue of the dark side of innovation that was answered and questioned in the chat. And I think that this is a very, very important issue. Vitrina put it, ask what can policy do to avoid the dark side of innovation? I would like to add, what can people do? And this is a problem of democracy. But collective action, I think that is part of the answer. You perhaps know this book by Shoshana Zuboff, The Surveillance Capitalism. Well, if you read it, it is going to give you nightmares. But a week ago, we read in the newspapers that workers of Google are unionizing. And they are unionizing because they don't want that their work goes to face recognition in the Mexican frontier. And so you see, people are key in facing the dark side of innovation. Because if people and collective action is not there, things can be done from policy. But well, perhaps they are going to be a little bit weak. And my last comment, perhaps, about what Leonardo said is that he's absolutely right in that we are facing very, very severe dilemmas. And one of the most challenging one is the dilemma between sustainability and economic growth, because economic growth is very important for governmental stability. And so a government that goes through election each 5 years and have to deliver economic growth, because if not, look at, well, we have here Carlos Acevedo from Bolivia. So perhaps a country that faced that dilemma in such a heavy way. And in a sense, we are all jailed into this dilemma. And from the way we can solve it, I think that it's not far from saying that the fate of humanity depends. And so that's for what Leonardo said about the questions. Well, I have already talked about Vitrina question. And then there is a two-side question from Africa. And it has to do with, well, how can we put the theory of national system of innovation into practice? I don't know. I don't know because I don't know sufficiently. I am ashamed of that, Africa. But I can tell you something from my experience in another developing country. The first one is, if you read the strategy of economic development of Hirschman, you will find there a key rule. He says, development is not as much about great plans and how you put the more efficiently resources in different places. Development is about unearthing the strengths you have, those that are invisible, those that are fragmented, and put those strengths to work for development. Well, science, technology, and innovation is part of our strengths that so many times are invisibilized, are fragmented. We cannot even count of them well. Make it work for development, and then you are going to bottom up, slowly build what you want to build. And remember always that learning is key. Benteke Lundvall and Freeman told us once and again, learning is key. Remember that we do not have opportunities to learn, and the opportunities we have are fragile. So keep your garden, tender your garden, protect your learning places, because from them you are going to build your future. And a last remark, coming back again to Freeman. I don't remember where I read this. I read so much things about written by Freeman, but he said in some of his work, yes, I think that is in, as times goes by with Locke. He talked about the difference between Britain and Italy, in the sense that in Britain, Newton was a genius, was a hero, was a national hero. And Galileo Galilei in Italy, he was not burned like Giordano Bruno, but so I would like, why is this important? Because pride is important. Pride is fundamental, absolutely fundamental. You need to believe in yourself. You need to be proud of yourself. And you have always reason to be that. But sometimes you forget it. And many times you even don't know. So my question is, do you have heroes in Africa in terms of science, technology, and innovation? I can tell you that we have that in Latin America, and probably you don't know them. And I'm sure that in Asia is the same. So proud is important. And if we need to back our statement, remember, this comes from Freeman. So for the moment being, I would like to stop and pass the floor to whatever want to take it, Leonardo, perhaps Joao, or whoever. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. I would like to just repeat some of the questions that were posed in the chat. So we give the floor first to Leonardo to answer and to comment, to Judith Sutz's questions, and to the people's question, the people from the chat. And after Leonardo answering, and I invite everyone to pose additional questions and comment again in those questions, okay? First, Judith already commented, but I think it's important to repeat. Bettina asked if does policy have a role in addressing the dark side of innovation? If so, how should it look like? How should it look like? The question posed by Johnson Okhori was two questions. So the first one was, what frontiers of the national systems of innovation are there for emerging economics in Africa? Because there is apparently a disconnect in the choosing and pursuit of goals between the two economics, developing and emerging. Second, while many African governments formulate national systems of innovation policies, implementing them have been a huge hurdle to cross. Please suggest easy ways to overcome this in bringing policy to practice. And then Souza Sama also posed some questions I will read for you all. I would like to give a comment on addressing the dark side of innovation. I think there are many institutions responsible for addressing this issue and then policy country can address the dark side of innovation by defining the strategic domain for enterprises and investments and orienting universities and scientific center by funding some specific area for R&D. The second comment is economic enterprises responsible for addressing the dark innovation by applying the social responsibility, waste management, quality product, adopting an organizational culture that focuses on ethics and etc. And third, society and social and civil association. Values, culture, level of awareness of society can address the dark side of innovation and be aware of the negative effects of innovation and taking actions against any economic enterprises or policies that may have a negative effect on their lives or on nature, like climate change issues, etc. So feel free to comment on these comments and to answer some of the questions. And for everyone in the site, in the chat, I will collect new questions after Leonardo and everyone answers this first round of questions.
Well, thank you very much, Joao. There are a lot of interesting questions there. I think that one of the part which make most fuss is about the dark side of innovation and the policy part of it. I was trying to stress in this lecture about we need to consider not just in policy, but perhaps in our framework, the considerations of the complete ontology of effects of technology, not just the expected and good effects, but also the other one that also exists. In terms of policy, how to deal with the dark side of innovation, it's much pretty clear. We have a reactive institutional policy. The problem of innovation is that we are dealing with new things. We don't know the effects of new things. We need to we need to wait until technology goes into social and environmental environments, sorry, in order to understand which kind of unwanted effects are taking place there. And then the policy is a control one. It's the control of trying to do some regulation about that effects. But that needs also knowledge, and that's interesting. Because most of the innovation systems, they are focused just in knowledge, trying to foster technology. But there is not the same level of knowledge and effort trying to understand the unwanted effects. So there is a science that is not taking place there. We had a lot of questions about externalities that sometimes we don't have the studies, and we don't have the studies in long term. So that's what Ulrich Beck, a sociologist, stressed about the risk society. We are taking decisions trying to foster technologies into the frontier, of course, try to get our growth, and that's valuable, of course, and we should continue to do so. But we should also continue to make some policy changes, precautionary changes, and try to have our science do more trying to understand the possible outcomes of technology, not try to wait until the outcomes striking us in the face. We need to consider that also into the national systems of innovation. What kind of regulation, what kind of rules can do that? Not just about interaction. There is other part of learning. We need learning also about institutional learning. So I heard that some of the questions, some of the people answer one of the questions, and there is also new routines into organizations. There is a social consideration of technology. There is precautionary technology. There is responsible innovation management, which I try to foster here in Mexico since years from now. So there are practices inside organizations and inside firms, but we should consider this also into the theory. That's the most interesting part. Freeman and Carlota Perez stress in one of the papers that we need to have an institutional reaction to technological change in order to guide the progress of technological change into the most wanted part. Okay, we need that. We need also the right institutional setup to do so, but we need also a precautionary institutional change before the technology gets into our environments and in our societies. We need a precautionary science also. There is a movement from policy in Europe that is stressed the responsible innovation practices. So they are already thinking about green chemistry. They are thinking about to change the innovation from the design of the innovation, thinking about the consequences of innovation. What I am talking about here is innovation practices management, not the meso-macro level of understanding that we need to understand in national systems of innovation. There is another part of the theory that must be stressed and detailed. So, well, I think that with this insight, perhaps I answer part of the questions.
Yeah, I like to remember that the floors are also open to everyone who wants to comment or speak and comment on the questions. But I'm already taking a new set of questions, the one that were posed in the chat. So I will read for you, and please first Judith, Sutz, and Leonardo, if you want to comment them, but we can invite other people to participate in the discussion. I read the questions posed by Gabriel Yogo. The first question he asked, why do you connect Freeman institutional perspective with North? Personally, I think that is an important question. Leonardo, I think that they come from very different literatures, and it's interesting to differentiate a bit them. I mean, I endorse this question. I'm not sure what's the thinking of Gabriel Yogo on the matter, but I think that this should be stressed. The second question is, what is wrong when developing countries institution or the specialization patterns? Since we are from Latin America, this is a question that it's always, that should also be posed. Third, how do you connect micro, meso, and macro in terms of roles? And the fourth question he asks is, how do we differentiate roles from habits and routines? Okay, there's also the question from Alemayehu Temesgen, and I will read it, it's a paragraph. It is obvious that innovation is not a one-man island game, particularly agricultural innovation, which requires collective action. Some books says collective action could be measured by proxy indicators like social capital. Other books use various methods based on objectives and research questions. My question for discussion is, how do we measure collective action in agricultural innovation systems? Only for clarity. Thank you. So if Leonardo or Judith Sutz wants to comment, and if I will take this last question by Jeff Flat here. Have we learned new things from the pandemic situation? Just to finish this round of questions.
I leave to Leonardo the complicated, more complicated ones.
Well, thank you. I think that there is a lot of interest in this part of the institutional part and rules. The question from Gabriel, it's a really interesting one, and I want to answer that first. The influence of the thinking of North, I think that is expressed in the book of Lundvall from 1992 in the chapter 2, where there is a collaboration of Bjorn Johnson, and also is expressed in the 1997 book of Edquist, also in the chapter about institutions. There are some, perhaps some insights not complete clearly into Christopher Freeman's work, but I think that he is considering a wider understanding about these human social systems. He's not thinking just about the infrastructure that can support innovation. He's thinking about what are the values of the people, how this guide their action and their behavior, and if perhaps that kind of explains the performance of innovation. So he's thinking more broadly. And Nord stressed some important issues. He has done a lot of historical work, as we already know, and he stressed that the part that moves institutions and the performance of economics is taking part from ideology, from the system of beliefs. So there are some elements that we can take as insights. I think that Christopher Freeman's is coherent with this part of North. I don't know if Freeman had read North, but I know that in the 90s, North, as a Nobel Prize winner, he has a lot of bigger considerations into the academic part. So I think that we should go back to Freeman, of course, into these insights, but also look about these chapters with a collaboration of Bjorn Johnson about institutions. He is a Norwegian academic. He has done a tremendous work trying to connect institutional studies with innovation, and it's not an easy task when you see institutional studies. There is a lot of different work and different authors that we can take, and into the community of institutional studies there is no common ground. Sometimes there are a lot of tensions also, so it's a tremendous work. I really recommend to search into those two chapters in Lumbal work and Edwest's book also, and we can understand the conceptions of institutions, and this will respond some of the questions about habits and routines. They consider that institutions could be habits also, beliefs also, values also. How can we synthesize that? I synthesize myself as institutions are axiological points to guide behavior. Could be routines, routines made by the agents or perhaps by the environment of the agents. It seems like the institutional studies propose that the environment is fostering the behavior of the agents. So perhaps the values of those routines and those habits are proposed by someone who we don't know sometimes who that is. And we can connect that with what Professor Sutz mentioned before about power, about who can have the power to stress some politics, but also there is some social power, who can stress social norms, social habits. So we are now dealing with the topic about culture. So it's a really interesting one. I think that try to study the systems of innovation in a more local way, such as local, urban, and regional, can make us have connection with this kind of issues of culture and rules and habits and social norms. There is a really good work of Cristina, I can remember the second name, Valieri, I guess. I can share with you all the complete name, but she has a lot of understanding and how social norms emerge. And of course, there is the work of Elinor Ostrom, also a Nobel Prize winner. So there is a lot of work that we can take on to guide our national system of innovation framework, our categories, and our methodologies also.
So Joe, I think Bengtoke will have something to say. Can we listen to him, Bengtoke?
I think I want to thank the speaker for a very nice presentation. I just wanted to comment on this systemic coherence. I think it's a very important concept. And I mean, it's very important that very different systems can perform extremely well with very different constellations, which are in both cases coherent. I mean, let me just take a very current phenomenon that artificial intelligence is now completely dominated by the United States and China. And of course, these are two countries where institutions at every single level are extremely different. But it doesn't rule out that. So you cannot even say that you require a very specific constellation of institutions and coherence to cope with one specific technology. So in general, I think, I think that pairing, combining the innovation system with historical analysis, where you have discontinuities. This is what Chris Freeman did, is one of the best ways to understand the dynamics and the kind of contradictions and coevolution between technologies and institutions. So some national systems which have been too coherent and too successful for a long time will be very vulnerable when they are confronted with dramatic change. And I think the best way to understand that is to combine the analysis of national innovation systems with these continuities in terms of technologies and institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lundvall. I would like to pose another question that came from the audience. Martin Bayer, he asked, would it be possible to get an answer on digital learning in the context of national innovation systems with respect to national boundaries and level of analysis, sectoral, technological, regional, or combination in the post-COVID-19 era? So this is a question. I would like also to invite whether Gabriel Hugo wants to comment on the answers of Leonardo Souza and the question on the comments made by Lundvall as well, because he asked some of the questions related to it. And myself, I would like to ask whether we should think also in terms of coherence between the innovation systems and the social problems and the environmental problems of the specific countries. Because I also agree that coherence is an interesting concept, but we also have to be every time in mind that there are specific social problems and environmental problems in the specific regions. And one of the people who asked one of the questions asked, what should be the easy track to make a policy, an innovation policy? I think that the first question should be, which are the specific social problems, environmental problems of the specific countries? And then you think about innovation policies related to these things. I think that is, if I could say one single word on that matter, it would be this one. So I give the floor again to Gabriel Hugo, to Leonardo, or everyone who wants to comment Martin Bayer's question, or even Lundvall, or... We still have comments?
If I may.
Alan Freeman, okay, Judith Sutz first, and then Alan Freeman would like to answer.
Oh,
okay?
No. I have already talked too much. Go to Alan, please,
okay.
please.
Please, Alan Freeman, welcome.
Alan, you have to unmute, please.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Very good. Sorry to interrupt your proceedings, although I've been watching them with fascination, and it is a very strange sensation. I was just saying to my wife, Radhika Desai, that whenever I hear the name Freeman, it's as if I was back at school and the teacher had called me. It's that party effect. Anyway, I wanted to thank you all for this, but I particularly just want to introduce at one stage something sort of advance notice. I'm sure you all know that September the 11th this year will be the 100th anniversary of my father's birth. And there will be many events surrounding that, but there's two that I want to give you sort of advance notice of, and we'll be talking about this later on in the series. there is a trust, a charitable trust that's been created, as I've mentioned before, for preserving Christopher Freeman's legacy. And we're looking at ways that we can involve all of you in that process. There's a website, freemanchrist.org. It's not very well developed. So what we're going to be doing is, well, raising money. That's one of the things. But we're going to try and arrange for archiving all Chris's works, properly archiving, so that they don't just disappear when the people who are paying for the website go away, and also to produce a reader of Chris's works, which is well advanced. We hope that it will be ready by September, and thanks to everybody here I know is contributing to that. It's going to be a very important work. And then we're going to be trying to arrange to put all Chris's works online, so that if any of you know of some obscure letter that he's written or an endorsement that he gave for something you wrote that may not be known to history, do please make a mention of it by just visiting the site and saying that. That's all. I'm just giving you a heads up, as we say in Canada, that's what's going to happen. This is absolutely marvelous. I'm very pleased to see it, and I'm sure Chris would have been amazed at the results of his activity. Thank you so much. I'm finished.
Thank you, Alan Freeman. Now, Judith Sutz, if you want finally to comment, if you still have energy to do that.
No, I just was, I was looking into the exchange about issues of institutions. I would just want to share with you something that I learned from a PhD student of mine. She is a PhD in economic history, but she came from sociology. And she discovered for me Avner Greif. Avner Greif is a sociologist, and his work on institutions that includes the issue of trust and culture, I highly recommend it to you. This is one thing I want to mention, because this has been a session in which we have shared a lot about readings, and this is important. This is very, very important. We need new insight of what is worth reading, because it's so overwhelming, the number of issues that we need that. And the second one, if I may, read a paper by Elinor Ostrom, 1996, Crossing the Great Divide in World Development. I think that you will find the answer to many of the questions that have been raised today. And the last question I see in the chat, have we learned new things from the pandemic situation? Well, I would say that we not learned, we reaffirmed our knowledge that the rich are for the rich. And this is a very dramatic situation. And we have learned that we need our own capabilities, resources, strengths, and political will to be able to survive when the rich are only for them. And the pandemic is perhaps, this one is going to go away, but what we read from virologists is this is coming again in 10 years, in 15 years. So we should look very carefully. I think that this is a very important question. Perhaps we haven't reflected enough on what has happened in terms of innovation, in terms of greediness, in terms of divide during this pandemic. I think that this is very important and is going to define the shape of our national system of innovation in the future in a great deal. Thank you.
I'd like to make another comment, one of the final comments, I think, but on the issues posed, because one of the questions raised by Leonardo in his presentation was how do we tackle innovation, institutional change, right? I mean, it is a big issue since, I mean, institutions is not the only things that matter regarding innovation system, but it's a very important issue. It is an explanatory element altogether with others, of course, structural, productive structures like Gabriel Bowles, like Gabriel commented. But when we think about institutional change, I do think that we also need to have to have a closer look on the social groups and the different and distinct social groups that are related with each institutional setup. And the power relations among them and the concurrence among them. I think that's something that should be more stressed, because it's not about perhaps changing the values and the ethics of the people that are already in power and already making the institution. It's because there are different social groups with different ethics, different perspectives. It's how do they relate inside each institutional framework that will really change the ethical and value perspective that sustains, that founds this some institutional change framework. So this is also have some relation with many sociological perspectives. I would not list all of them, but I think that is an important element to think about institutional change. I just quoting not quoting, but remember one of them is Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn also, when he was trying to understand the social aspect of scientific revolutions, he mentioned that the scientific revolution does not occur only because this very same group changed his mind. It's because conflicting groups are trying to propose alternative explanatory perspectives to the phenomena. Is that because of these conflicting groups inside of the academic world of the universities that some big change may occur. So he was trying to address that there are social groups inside the universities, and inside also we can go a bit beyond him and say that there are social groups inside the states, inside the institution framework, and this is the how do they conflict, or how do they have their concurrence among each others. This, I think, is one of the most, in my personal view, one of the most promising avenue to explore regarding the questions posed by Leonardo Souza. So I
would like to mention something, Joao.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you very much. I really like what you said before, and also what Ben Hake mentioned before also. I think that one of the dilemmas of social systems is how can get convergence of activities and of behaviors, right? Because there are agents with their own preoccupations, their own interests. So the collective phenomena and the convergence of behaviors is a really interesting part of our social systems. And perhaps some of the answer of that question is that there are some groups, political groups, that could be in power or could rise up from the bottom up, from the grassroots perhaps, but there are social leaders who can stress some points, not just political, but also in informal networks, right? And the most interesting part is that they stress some priorities over other priorities. The most important part of institutions is that itself serves like a teleology that guides the collective coherence of a system, right? So connecting with the pandemic's question, the pandemics, we have learned that some of the countries, perhaps in Latin America, there are some politics that doesn't want to do science and innovation to try to foster this global problem. So we are just waiting that developed countries have the vaccines and they can sell that vaccines to us. So we are not dealing with the science and technology issues here. And that's part of how some networks and some politics stress some priorities. And that's part of the institutions. And that's part of the national system of innovation, which kind of values are in those groups, social groups, who can take decisions with effects on the rest of the population. Which are their priorities? Is science and technology? Is something else? And that perhaps can also answer the question about coherence of the system. They want coherence, they want a national system of innovation, or perhaps they are thinking about anything else, some other values, some other priorities, right? So perhaps including a meta-governance concept can, from the complex systems, we can tackle that kind of question, where there is no such as one central coordination agent, but it's an emergent process that can take place to this coherence. We can guide the system, but we cannot control them, right? So, well, that's part of the insights I want to share to all of you. Thank you.
Does everyone wants to comment on Martin Baya's question? He posed it again on the web chat, and I think that we are reaching the final of our session, but still we have one question and another one from Solomon Sama, and I take this two as the final question so we can finish our presentation, okay? If someone wants to comment on that. First is the Martin Baya posed again the question between the pandemics and artificial intelligence, right? And digital learning on the context of the post-COVID era. And Soler Sama asked another question. If I combine the answer of Professor Bengt Lundvall with the question of Jeff Flatt about the current national innovation systems that can be current if they face the dramatical issue as COVID-19 crisis. I think dramatical issues crisis as COVID can speed up the learning people, groups, organizations to build up a national, regional, national systems. And the dramatical issues crisis also can do the vice versa by making national, regional systems of innovation in current. For example, the current situation has made many countries rethink their position in the United Group States or some organizations that they are integrated in. I think the learning theories, comportamental theories, human capital, ethics, and values are critical in addressing the epistemic dilemmas and challenges of the evolution of national system of innovation. Okay, Martin Baya, I think that it's already answered his questions, or partially at least. If anyone wants to comment on the last of the Soleme Sama, and we are reaching the final of our session. So if wants to do final remarks as well, and I invite everyone to do final remarks.
May I say something?
Of course.
I think the COVID thing, I think that one lesson we have learned is the strength of science. Another lesson is the very problematic institutional context, meaning that the results of science are reserved for rich countries. Third thing is the fundamental role still played by nation states. actually nationalism has been sharpened during the crisis when we need the opposite. I mean, we really need global collaboration and responsibility, and we see it nowhere. So I think in general, I think it's legitimate to focus on how to promote innovation, especially in favor of sustainability and inclusion, etc., at the national level. But we also need to think how we get out of the nation level and begin to think about the formation of global governance and moving towards global systems. I think this is, for me, one of the most important lessons from this COVID-19 crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Lundvo. Does anyone wants to share some final remarks? So I think that we are reaching the final of the session. I'd like to thank you all for the amazing session, Leonardo, Souza, Judith, Sutz, especially both of you. And thank you very much. And also Rajesh, of course, that is organizing everything. But it was also a great session, and I expect to see you in the next session, the 11th lecture of this series. Okay, thank you very much, and see you next.
So before we close, a small announcement before we close. I congratulate the speaker, the chair, and all those who participated, and also Joe, who controlled the session. Today's was an excellent lecture and an extraordinary chairing, and we learned a lot from both of you, and the rich discussion. It was a very stimulating discussion. And as Joe has already announced, we are going to have 2 panel discussions at the end of the series. That is on 1st of April and on 7th of April. We started on 7th January and we are ending on 7th April. So these 2 panel discussions are going to be very important. We are going to have the senior most scholars in the field to discuss about questions. So these discussions will be revolving around questions received from the participants of these 12 lectures. So I request all of you, all the participants, to send us well-framed questions. You can write up to 150 words, explain your question, contextualize your question, so that through these questions, the essence of the discussions come out in the 2 panels. So kindly, we are receiving very less number of questions. So we have to generate our questions. That may not be may not be good. It will sound monotonous if we start writing questions. So I request all of the participants to send us these interesting questions, well-framed questions. Thank you very much. So I request all of you to unmute. All of you, please unmute and say bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Nice
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. See you all.
Hello, Judith.
It's always a very nice moment.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi, Bentoke. Nice to see you.
Wonderful to see you always.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Lena.
Bye.
Hello, Lena. Bye-bye.
Bye. Johnson. Hello, Johnson.
Bye.
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 Hi, Johnson. How are you? Please send your questions, Johnson. Please send your questions. You please write it in detail and send us. Interesting questions.
Thank you. Thank you.